Good afternoon. The hearing will now come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Fixing EPA's Integrated Risk Information System. A little more than a year ago, Susan Dudley, then the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB, OIRA, and Dr. George Gray, then the head of the Office of Research and Development at EPA, testified before this subcommittee. The hearing was to examine the stunning lack of productivity in new and revised risk assessments for chemicals in the EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, IRIS. Dudley and Gray testified that the productivity was a complicated approval process for assessments, which this flowchart produced by EPA, Mr. Whitaker, illustrated. This is the complicated that they needed to fix. So they testified that they had solved the problem by developing a streamlined approval process, which this flowchart, also produced by EPA, illustrates. Again, Mr. Whitaker, if you could show the complicated system, chart 1, okay, and then the simplified system, chart 2. Gray's and Dudley's testimony reminded me of a famous quotation from Marx, not Carl Chico. Well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Gray's and Dudley's testimony strained credulity in other ways. Dudley explicitly denied in her testimony that OIRA, the office that she headed, ever challenged scientific assessments by EPA scientists. Scientific assessment of the toxic effect of chemical exposure would not even remotely be OIRA's job. Our staff today released a report on IRIS that shows that OIRA did just that on several occasions, enough to conclude that intruding on scientific assessments was routine for OIRA. Dudley testified that the streamlined process, that was chart 2, for approving IRIS listings was entirely EPA's handiwork. Our staff's report shows that the process was a result of a multi-year interagency process that was driven by OIRA, not by EPA. OIRA's conduct in requiring a perpetual paralysis in approval procedures and intruding on the independence of EPA scientists appears to have been intended to keep IRIS from doing its job and to keep us all in the dark about the public health consequences of chemical exposures. It certainly had that effect. While 70 chemicals were in some stage of review by EPA, EPA averaged 3 new and revised IRIS entries a year. The new EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, announced a new process on May 21, 2009. This chart illustrates the new process. If we are to believe our own eyes, the new process is substantially streamlined. Just as important, discussions between federal government agencies about IRIS listings will be transparent. There is no excuse for keeping interagency discussions secret from Congress and from the American people. We are entitled, I'm speaking as a member of Congress and as one of the American people, we are entitled to know the potential health effects of chemical exposures, even if various government agencies find the chemicals very useful. And no agency can trigger an even more tortured approval process by declaring that a chemical is mission critical. Under strict rules of grammar, the word perpetual is like the word naked or nude. Neither allows for degrees, but the IRIS approval process devised by Dudley's OIRA was perpetual for all chemicals and more perpetual for mission critical chemicals. We are interested in hearing today about EPA's new procedures, and there should be little doubt that the procedures are an improvement. But we need to see how the procedures work in practice to know whether the procedures are enough of an improvement. The institutional interests and ambitions of federal agencies survive presidential transitions. There will still be agencies who want to use chemicals without annoying restrictions and may try to avoid risk management issues by obstructing the risk assessment of an IRIS listing. And it is human nature to forsake power reluctantly, even the unwholesome, even sinister power that OIRA exercised over EPA's scientific assessments. The American people need and deserve credible, scientifically sound assessments of the health effects of chemical exposures. That means the EPA must be in charge, not OIRA. The subcommittee will continue to work to follow the work of IRIS, and I have written the GAO to ask that they closely monitor the new IRIS process as well. And I have now included both IRIS staff report on IRIS as well as a new report from the Center for Progressive Reform with my statement for the record. I now recognize my distinguished colleague, Dr. Brown, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Integrated Risk Information System, IRIS, process was originally developed in the mid-1980s for a specific task. Different offices throughout the EPA were relying on different assessments of the health effects of exposure to chemicals. IRIS was intended to establish a uniform database within EPA that represented consensus determinations. Over time, however, IRIS became an authoritative resource on chemical toxicity. As a credit to the agency's diligence, other agencies, states, and the international community and industries increasingly began to rely on IRIS, and the assessments took on increased importance. These outside groups have sought to impact a process that was not initially designed to handle external pressures. The result has been an IRIS process that has effectively broken down. As we learned from GAO last year, EPA had a backlog of 70 ongoing assessments and managed to complete only 2 assessments in each of the last 2 years. Even when EPA managed to produce assessments, the National Academy of Sciences has roundly criticized their work. The competing priorities of issuing assessments in a timely manner and producing assessments that are scientifically credible are central to the problems we face today. The completely unsatisfactory timeframes for these assessments are the results of several factors. Reviews are becoming more complex as attention increases for high-profile chemicals. EPA management and program decisions are delaying completion. Outside stakeholder reviews are becoming more detailed, and congressional action is becoming more prevalent. All of these delays have compounding effects and create a domino effect on schedules, as Mr. Stephenson pointed out in previous testimony. Until recently, the IRIS process was an opaque process that had no scheduled deadlines and limited outside review. While the previous administration's proposed process wasn't perfect, it was the first time that the process was formalized, thoroughly examined, and given strict timelines. If nothing else, the previous administration recognized the untenable nature of the existing IRIS process and presented a proposal to fix the problem. While the previous process wasn't perfect, neither is this new process. Previous processes required EPA to develop a consensus assessment, the original purpose of the IRIS process. The newly proposed process does not require each EPA office to concur on assessments, but rather to simply consult. Furthermore, these internal agency consultations are not required to be available to the public, which ultimately limits transparency. EPA's failure to develop consensus assessments raises the questions of how authoritative and useful IRIS will be in the future. One of the arguments for the new proposal is its new streamlined process. As I mentioned earlier, the natural tension between thoroughness and timeliness begs the question of whether a streamlined process will ultimately sacrifice scientific credibility, especially considering recent negative reviews from the National Academy of Sciences. In order to streamline the process, the new administration has cut out quality control measures, such as visibility in the adjudication of peer review comments, the requirement for a qualitative assessment review, the public review of that qualitative assessment, the evaluation of agency interest in closing data gaps for mission-critical chemicals, the design and implementation of new studies for mission-critical chemicals, and the development of short-term research projects that may aid in filling data gaps. More importantly, this new streamlined process uses a bit of sleight of hand to take the scientific literature review and data calling periods off the schedule entirely. This work will still be done, but EPA doesn't account for this time in its schedule, allowing them to create the appearance of a speedier process. One of the largest criticisms of the previous proposal was the role played by the White House, and more importantly, OMB and the Office of Regulatory Information and Affairs. Despite these previous criticisms, the new process states that White House offices will continue to be involved in the interagency consultation process. Apparently, this was only a concern when it was politically fashionable. If anyone had a problem with the previous administration's meddling, you can probably expect more of the same, since OIRA is staffed almost exclusively by career civil servants. Some may try to dismiss this concern by noting that the EPA is now ultimately responsible for the process, but they always had final authority, even under the previous process. It could be claimed that even with that previous authority, EPA was still subordinate to the influence of OMB. Similarly, one could argue that EPA will truly have final authority under the new process, but ultimately the EPA administrator still worked for the president. The only difference is that now maybe the administrator also works for the new environment czar, Carol Browner. We aren't really sure about this, since she is removed from any type of congressional oversight, transparency, or accountability. I hope that science's rightful place doesn't turn out to be behind the cloak of deliberative process and executive communication. Despite concerns about White House meddling, OMB has provided useful input into EPA assessments according to GAO's 2008 report. While OMB should certainly not use this review process to obstruct or prevent assessments, EPA also shouldn't be afraid to address valid scientific inquiries. Additionally, OMB plays an important role in the shepherding the interagency process. Without OMB taking the lead in this process, it remains to be seen if EPA will have enough clout to force or compel other agencies to comply with its timelines and directions. This also raises another question relating to who will ultimately be the adjudicator of conflicts and arbiter of scientific disputes. In an ideal world, neither the White House nor EPA would be involved in this, as it is truly a discussion meant for the scientific community. Unfortunately, in the real world, there needs to be a bureaucratic referee. Is EPA truly an unbiased partner when they are the agency that drafts the assessments? What incentive does EPA have to incorporate peer reviewers' comments that may contradict their opinions? Are we setting up a system where EPA will be responsible for monitoring its own work? Even if EPA is unbiased, are the Office of Research and Development staff tasked to conduct these assessment experts on every chemical are aware of all the science? If the answer is no, then aren't we essentially making pure but poorly informed assessments? If none of these questions matter because assessments go through peer review, why would it matter if other agencies, industry, or the White House were involved, since the final product will be peer reviewed? As you can tell, I remain very skeptical of the new process, but I do see some commendable aspects. New transparency measures for the interagency review process are promising, even though they don't extend into internal communication between EPA line offices, which could prove to be just as informative and important. Despite this potential bright spot, several other questions remain. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm attaching a letter from Toxology Excellence for Risk Assessment, tear to my statement that I will enter it in the record. I appreciate your indulgence and look forward to the witness's testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I ask unanimous consent that all additional opening statements submitted by members be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. It is my pleasure now to introduce our witnesses. Dr. Kevin Tyson is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Science in the Office of Research and Development at EPA. And Dr. John Stevenson is back. He is the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the Government Accountability Office. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. It is the practice of this subcommittee to receive testimony under oath, although we have not made it our habit to refer cases for perjury prosecution, which I'm sure is a great relief to Dr. Gray and Ms. Dudley. You also have the right to be represented by counsel. Do any of you have any objection to taking an oath? Both witnesses indicated that they did not. You also have the right to be represented by counsel. Do either of you have a counsel here, counsel with you? Also, I understand that you may have, although both of you I know have encyclopedic knowledge of this topic, you may have other staff with you who may need to, who might need to help with an answer. Would it be helpful if anybody else from your staffs who might need to help you with an answer also take the oath at the same time? Okay. All right. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? The record will show that both witnesses have taken the oath. We will now begin with Dr. Kevin Tyson. Dr. Tyson, please begin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Dr. Kevin Tychman, the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Science in EPA's Office of Research and Development. I am also the Acting EPA Science Advisor, and in this role I serve as a member of the Office of Science and Technology Policy's Task Force on Scientific Integrity. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss with you EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, IRIS. Before I begin, I would like to thank Congressman Miller and this subcommittee for your support of the IRIS program. The importance of a successful IRIS program to the health of the American people was acknowledged by this subcommittee in 2 past hearings and by Chairman Miller's previous introduction of legislation on this topic. Your continued interest in the future of the IRIS program is greatly appreciated. IRIS is one of EPA's most important and most public products. IRIS has been a highly regarded resource for providing information on the potential human health risks from long-term exposures to contaminants. IRIS assessments are used by EPA programs and regions as the scientific foundation for agency actions to protect human health. IRIS assessments are also used by environmental and health professionals in state and local governments as well as internationally. Because of the widespread use of IRIS risk information, it is of utmost importance that the process used to develop this information and the resulting assessments posted on IRIS reflect the highest possible standards for scientific quality, scientific integrity, transparency, and timeliness. Administrator Jackson, coming from careers at both EPA and the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, recognizes the critical role that EPA plays in disseminating timely, high-quality, and accessible human risk information on environmental contaminants. Just 4 months after coming to EPA, she announced a new IRIS process that is more responsive to the needs of the agency in its work to effectively and efficiently protect the health of all Americans. The new IRIS process is more timely, transparent, and will ensure the highest level of scientific integrity. It will rely on an opportunity for public review and comment, followed by a rigorous, open, and independent external peer review process to guarantee the scientific quality of the IRIS assessments. There are several aspects of the new process that I would like to highlight. First, the new IRIS process will be entirely managed by EPA. Second, there is no longer an opportunity for another federal agency to prolong the process by asking that additional research be conducted before an assessment can be produced. Instead, EPA will announce the chemicals that will be assessed far enough in advance so that any interested party could conduct short-term studies that could add to the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Third, all written comments from other federal agencies and White House offices will become part of the public record. Opportunities for scientific comment by other federal agencies and White House offices was maintained in the new process because EPA welcomes input from interested experts that may add to the scientific quality of the draft or final assessment. Also, the assessment process has been streamlined to ensure that more new and updated assessments are included on IRIS. While still robust, the assessment development process for most chemicals will be shortened to 23 months, speeding the availability of IRIS assessments. There are 2 steps introduced in the previous process that were retained in the new process. First, the opportunity for any interested party to provide information to EPA prior to the external peer review meeting. These listening sessions allowed interested parties to present scientific comments on draft IRIS assessments during the public comment period and before the external peer review period. EPA has found the listening sessions to be a valuable step in public outreach and participation. Second, changes in EPA's scientific judgments from public comments and peer review will be clearly documented and explained, maximizing the transparency of the final product. Finally, to give this new process an added boost, the Administrator has directed that for fiscal year 2010, resources for the IRIS program should be increased, and the President's budget request includes an additional $5 million and 10 FTE full-time equivalents for the IRIS program. In conclusion, EPA remains dedicated to listening and being responsive to the public, to independent experts, and to scientists and other federal science agencies as it develops IRIS human health assessments. The ability of EPA's program to succeed has been significantly improved now that some steps have been removed or revised. EPA is confident that we can continue to provide the critical human health risk information to EPA's program and regions that ensure the agency's actions protect the public health. Thank you very much, and I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Teichman. Mr. Stevenson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our prior findings and recommendations on EPA's IRIS program, as well as the results of our preliminary review of EPA's most recently announced IRIS reforms announced on May 21st, 2009. As you know, the IRIS database contains EPA's scientific position on the potential human health effects of exposure to the more than 540 chemicals in the environment. It is the critical component of EPA's capacity to support scientifically sound risk management decisions, policies, and regulations. In March 2008, we reported that the IRIS program was at serious risk of becoming obsolete because the agency had not been able to complete timely, credible chemical assessments or decrease its backlog of 70 ongoing assessments. EPA completed only 5 assessments last year and has only completed 1 assessment so far this year. We also found that the time frames for completing assessments were unacceptably long, often taking over a decade. In many cases, assessments became obsolete before they could be finalized and were stuck in an endless loop of assessment and reassessment. In April 2008, EPA unveiled a revised process, and we were disappointed to find out that it was not responsive to our recommendations and was actually worse than the process that it replaced, institutionalizing a process that would take 6 to 8 years at best to complete, enabling federal agencies to delay ongoing assessments by requesting additional research and declaring comments from other agencies deliberative and excluded from the public record. As we testified before this subcommittee last year, we were extremely concerned about the consequences of these problems because IRIS assessments are, after all, the cornerstone of scientific integrity at the agency. In fact, we added EPA's toxic chemical assessment and control processes to our January 2009 report on government-wide high-risk areas in need of increased attention by executive agencies and the Congress, a GAO designation reserved for only the most serious federal government problems. Today, I am pleased to report that while it is too soon to offer a blanket endorsement, the new IRIS process introduced by EPA on May 21st of this year appears to be a giant step in the right direction. In particular, we believe that the new IRIS process, if managed effectively, will be largely responsive to the recommendations we made in our March 2008 report. First, the process will be managed by EPA rather than OMB as the former process was. Second, it addresses key transparency concerns by expressly requiring that all written comments provided by other federal agencies on draft IRIS assessments be part of the public record. Third, the new process streamlines the previous one by consolidating and eliminating some steps and committing to a 2-year completion time frame. Importantly, it eliminates the step under which other federal agencies could have IRIS assessments suspended indefinitely to conduct additional research. We also believe that the requested increase of $5 million and 10 additional staff positions will help ensure that more resources are allocated to IRIS program to meet user needs. While these changes reflect a significant improvement that can help EPA restore the integrity and productivity of the program, we offer the following observations for EPA to consider as it implements the new process. First, there are no time frames stated for the literature search and data call in kind of the pre-step 1. This tends to understate the 23-month time frame for completing assessments. Second, it's not clear what the purpose of the interagency consultation meetings is, which is step 3 and step 6B on the new process, what the role of OMB and other White House offices are exactly, and whether decisions will be documented in the public from decisions coming out of those steps. Third, it seems to us that comments from the federal agencies, which is step 3, could be solicited at the same time draft assessments are sent to independent peer reviewers and the public, which is step 4, and saving additional time in the process. Fourth, it's not clear how EPA plans to respond to our March 2008 report recommendation to provide at least a 2-year notice of planned assessments. The new process does not specifically address such important planning steps as the call for nominations of chemicals to be assessed and the establishment of an IRIS agenda. We believe that giving agencies and the public more advanced notice of planned assessments would enable external parties with an interest in a given chemical to complete relevant research before the start of an IRIS assessment and thus make the assessment even more efficient. Finally, unlike a number of other EPA programs with statutory deadlines for completing various activities, no enforceable deadlines apply to the IRIS program. We believe that legislating statutory deadlines could help EPA better ensure the viability of this critical program. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the summary of my statement, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. We will now begin our first round of questions, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Stevenson, I want to talk about control of IRIS by EPA. IRIS, as Dr. Brown pointed out in his opening statement, has always provided for control, at least according to the statute, stated control by EPA, but in the last 8 years, certainly EPA's control was very much eroded by pressures from other agencies that, although the IRIS listing has no regulatory effect, it is a precursor to regulation. And there were agencies that liked using chemicals without restrictions and didn't want to have to mess with the risk management issues. So it was easy to stymie a risk assessment through IRIS and not have to worry about it. And there were officials at OMB who seemed to be more than happy to help them in that effort at OIRA, whether it was the other agencies or the manufacturers of the chemicals or simply an anti-regulatory zeal. OIRA was more than happy to block it. Mr. Stevenson, in light of all that history, how can we be sure? Should we continue to worry that EPA will not, in effect, be in control, even though it may, according to the stated procedures, be in control?
A multifaceted question. OMB does serve a purpose in facilitating interagency comments. There's no question. The problem with the old process was that all of those comments were declared deliberative, and so there was no honest broker, if you will, as to what comments were being provided and when. So we think the fact that this process allows for complete transparency in all of those comments, which are supposed to be comments on the scientific integrity of the assessment, be made public. So that's huge. Having said that, you know, EPA, like every other agency, works for the White House, and OMB is an office of the White House. And so the proof is going to be in the pudding as to how much influence OMB may or may not have in this current process. And now with you asking us to do so, we are going to be watching that closely.
Are there things for us to watch for? Are there going to be early indicators that will tell us that EPA is truly in charge or only nominally in charge and it's still being run out of OIRA or by the White House?
Well, the only thing you can really do is track individual assessments through the process and see what kind of comments are made and by whom and what the reaction is to those comments. Interestingly, in the old OMB, while it's true they said that EPA was in charge, if you talk to OIRA, if you talk to the other part of OMB, they would clearly, who did the part reviews, if you're familiar with those, they clearly said that OMB was in charge. So even within OMB, it was unclear who was in charge of that IRIS process.
Mr. Stevenson, the opening statements kind of raised the question of whether there should be more process, more procedures, more of a chance to challenge EPA, that EPA should not be the final decider, should not make the final decision on IRIS listings. But do IRIS listings have any regulatory effect? Is there anything that anybody cannot do or has to do because of the way a chemical is listed in IRIS?
No, you correctly mentioned that it is a precursor to deciding how to control dangerous chemicals if you need to at all. And so we view it as a purely scientific process that shouldn't be mixed with scientific policy, which also has a legitimate role.
Well, if there is a regulatory effort after an IRIS listing to manage a risk that an IRIS listing identifies, how is the science treated there? Are all the same issues revisited in the regulatory process?
Well, sure. I mean, you have an opportunity to question the relevance of the science for a given regulation, but each one is a case-by-case issue. The beauty of IRIS is that it is the official agency position on a given chemical, and therefore the starting point to decide where you want to go from there. It doesn't mean anything about regulation purely.
But if the formaldehyde industry, for instance, wanted to argue that formaldehyde is actually good for you, they could do that in the regulatory process for risk management, any risk management regulations. Is that correct?
Well, I would think they would do it in both places, in the IRIS process as well as the regulatory process.
My time has expired. I now recognize Dr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to go along with what Chairman Miller was just talking about, Mr. Stevenson, it's my understanding that a lot of private sector stakeholders are basically using IRIS assessments as a de facto regulatory statement. Is this true?
I have no way of knowing that.
Okay. What part to play in the IRIS process should outside stakeholders play?
If they have, remember, IRIS is supposed to be a collection and a synthesis of existing research that's available at the time the assessment begins, essentially. And so there are good researchers and scientists throughout industry, throughout the other federal agencies, throughout academia. All of those people are allowed to contribute to an individual assessment once they see the draft assessment and it goes out for public comment. And all of those comments can be seen by the public and vetted by other scientists, and everyone in this process seemingly can see how EPA dispenses with each of those comments.
Chairman Miller referred to me as Dr. Brown. I'm a physician. There are some on this whole committee that would argue that I'm not a scientist, but I am. There's some research scientists that would argue that, but I'm an applied scientist, and I believe in the scientific process and believe in peer review and lots of it. And the more peer review that enters in the process, the greater I think we have in scientific integrity. When I graduated from medical school, things I was being taught at that time to be absolutely factual have subsequently been shown to not be factual. And I think we have a lot of things going on in public policy today, such as climate change caused by human effects on the climate are part of that, but it's kind of I don't want to go off on that tangent, but to get back to IRIS, though, is I'm just real concerned that there's not enough transparency. Ms. Stevenson, you talked about the transparency, but is all the discussion within the agency or within anybody who has comments on the assessments being done, is all of that available for public purview?
It's supposed to be.
Everything?
We hope so. Like you say, it's a scientific process, and we would hope all of that is very public and vetted in the public.
How about the oral arguments, with interagency oral arguments, any consultation meetings, things like that? Will all of those things be available for public purview?
We don't know, but that's why we say more clarification is needed in those consultation steps within the process. And if there are any decisions made, our recommendation would be that they be made public, but EPA may have a better clarification on that.
Doctor?
It is certainly our intention to make sure that all of the written comments are put in the public docket. But we also know that there are sometimes discussions that go on, and orally, we would hope in those discussions, and what we've tried to do since we'll be controlling the process, to encourage people to provide the important points, even in those oral discussions, in writing, so they are made open and transparent to the public. And that's just within the interagency discussion steps at Step 3 and Step 6A in your chart number 3, Mr. Chairman, if I remember correctly. I think it's also important to note that when there are disagreements potentially between agencies, which can occur, that's when it's a good time, in fact, to turn to peer review, Mr. Brown, just as you've identified. And so it's the consultations both inside the agency where we may have some scientific disagreement on a draft assessment, as well as when we have the interagency discussions, that those become, in fact, very good charge questions to the peer review panel for them to opine on to inform us in the federal system.
Well, I hope that you can assure this committee that all opinions, particularly dissenting views, within any oral discussion, consultation, is available for public purview, because I think it's absolutely critical for scientific integrity, first thing. Secondly, is to guarantee that there is a correct peer review process and that there's not a quashing of opposing views by any entity, whether it's an agency or an individual, a scientist, or what have you. I think it's absolutely critical for the health of this country and its health of science that those things. So please assure this committee that that's going to be the policy at EPA.
It is certainly something, as I think Mr. Stevenson has mentioned, that is a bit vague in the process as identified, and something that requires further discussion and clarification to be more precise. So I would prefer to have that discussion before I assure this committee at this particular time. But it is something we will certainly have discussion about. If I may, for just a brief moment, however, I want to make sure we are distinguishing sometimes between those comments that are scientific in nature and those that may be policy in nature, because it is indeed, we hope, with our IRIS process to really focus on the scientific comments, because indeed our IRIS assessments are not regulatory. And if I may draw attention actually to a report by the Bipartisan Policy Center that you may be familiar with, since it's co-chaired by Sherwood Bullard, a friend, I believe, of this committee in the past, okay, and has esteemed members on it such as Lynn Goldman and John Graham from, therefore, across the political spectrum.
I think the screen is actually obscuring the portrait of Mr. Bullard.
Oh, that I can't see. I apologize. But anyway, I did want to make it clear that, indeed, your comments about scientific disagreements we certainly want to make sure are aired, but we want to distinguish those from policy ramifications. These are the recommendations, in fact, from Sherman Bullard's bipartisan committee. Distinguishing between science and policy is not always easy or straightforward, and scientists must make choices based on values in the course of their work. Nonetheless, policy debate would be clarified and enhanced if a systematic effort were made to distinguish between questions that can be resolved through scientific judgments and those that involve judgments about values and other matters of policy. So what we're trying here is to keep the focus on the scientific arguments that are the basis for the conclusions drawn in our IRIS assessments, and it is later in subsequent steps when regulation occurs that the policy ramifications can be debated as well.
Well, thank you, Doctor. My time is long up, and the chairman's been very long-suffering, but I just want to make one statement, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Policy makes a difference, too, and it needs to be transparent, and we need to make absolutely certain that any discussion, policy or scientific, I think is available for the public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I now recognize Ms. Dowkemper for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for bringing forward this important hearing, and thank the witnesses for joining us today. I want to talk a little bit about the productivity side of things. And as we're looking at your new process here, you have certain durations, Dr. Teichman, on there, and I want to ask you about how EPA will guarantee that these dates are met. Obviously, it's a good, aggressive schedule, I believe, but how are you going to make sure that these dates are met for each of the different processes?
We're going to do our absolute best. In terms of a guarantee, I cannot promise that every assessment will last only 23 months. There will indeed be situations, and we hope they are few and far between, and indeed this is stated in the administrator's testimony as well that she gave 2 days ago on the other side of the hill, if you will, that in most assessments we expect to try and stick to the 23 months. I've worked for the administrator now for 5 months. I can tell you she is a very intelligent, very aggressive individual who will keep us on our toes and do everything she can to support our efforts. In that regard, you also should hopefully take some solace in the fact that the policy was discussed. I was certainly not in the room as it was, but among the administrator and her staff and officials within OMB, and I don't know, other agencies perhaps too, and there was agreement across the board on this particular process. So I believe there will be other agencies who will be held to task as we try and hold to this schedule to the commitments that they made to the administrator in those initial negotiations.
Mr. Stevenson, do you have any comments on this in terms of how you think this could be achieved?
We've already mentioned that some of the early steps are missing, so you're already behind the 8 ball in the 23 months. Most importantly, it's mentioned on the chart here that you're going to do a comprehensive literature search and data call, which will be in the, a notice. So there's a process that has to be followed to do that, which will take some time. In addition, our recommendation from 2008 about the importance of a 2-year planning window is critical here, so that the whole research community well in advance will know which chemicals are going to be assessed 2 years down the road, and can put together any research they deem appropriate before the process actually starts. That will completely avoid, the development of research as the particular chemical is being assessed and make the whole process more efficient. We think this is really ambitious, but we are going to be watching.
Also, as you were speaking, Mr. Stevenson, you were mentioning different, about 5 or 6 different improvements that you would like to see. And I guess I want to ask you, Dr. Teichman, about that, about his, Mr. Stevenson's testimony on that.
Well, some of them were just clarifications, but okay. Yes.
Well, some were clarifications and some I've written down. I'm not sure I've got them all correctly written, but I will state that as hopefully, and I think I can, if I parrot back correctly, the statement of my co-witness here, that if managed effectively, the new EPA process for IRIS would be considered very responsive to the GAO recommendations in the past. Therefore, we are trying to demonstrate a commitment to seriously consider what GAO tells us, and we will consider the recommendations that the co-witness has asked. We would like to have a chance to try the process as it's been agreed to, and I think Mr. Stevenson has said it's worth a try, but we need to take a look and see how we progress. I know that the chairman has asked GAO in a year to report back, and I think we're anxious to follow that particular path. But we will still nonetheless consider, certainly for clarification, the recommendations from GAO and even some of the potential changes if indeed they enhance the process in our estimation as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize myself for a second round of questions. We will be called for votes in maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and my intention will be just to have questions probably until that time, and then that will be the end of our hearing when we get called for votes. Dr. Teichman, there were questions about written, everything written is going to be available. There's no assertion that it's deliberative. We all get to see it. Congress sees it, the American people sees it, it's public. Dr. Brown asked questions about oral discussions, telephone conversations, at a water cooler, whatever, meetings. And to the extent that they produce any writing, the writing will be available. It's probably not reasonable to expect that everything will be transcribed. But in the past, when we have asked specifically Ms. Dudley about involved in what conversations and what conversations there were and what was said, she asserted a deliberative process privilege, which I've read the cases that discuss deliberative process privilege. It's a very light privilege. It's basically, it protects anything, discussions if the only reason that Congress or a court is asking for it is out of idle curiosity. But if there's any real need for it at all, that it should be available. my understanding is the administration does not, the EPA now does not assert a deliberative process privilege for any oral conversation. So if Congress calls upon people involved in the decision to tell us who was in the discussion, what they had to say, that would be those would be questions that you would answer as well as you could remember them. Is that correct?
I am not a lawyer, but that is certainly my interpretation as well.
Okay. All right. I think Ms. Dalkemper asked around the high-risk list or came close to it. Mr. Stevenson, I assume that being on the GAO's high-risk list is something that a federal government agency would regard about the same way a bank would regard being on the FDIC's watch list. It's not a favorite place to be. How long do you expect it would take IRS to kind of earn their way off that list?
The high-risk designation is not only designated to IRS, it has to do with TSCA reform as well. Mm-hmm. So we need to wait and see proof that the problems that we've observed have been addressed. And there's no, it's fairly subjective. It's up to GAO when we decide to add or remove things from that risk. It doesn't carry any designation other than the fact that we hope that the agency and the administration will devote greater attention to it, and the Congress for that matter. That's why we do it. So to get on that list, we're very, very, very concerned. We're a conservative agency, and it doesn't get put on that list lightly. There were only 3 new additions to the list this year, and this was one of them.
And Dr. Teichman, I assume it's a high priority to get off that list.
Most certainly, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Mr. Stevenson, you examined in the GAO report last year the IRS process specifically for a chemical called Royal Demolition Explosive, or RDX. What's the status of that?
We haven't done any specific work on that. It was one of the chemicals we highlighted to illustrate how broken the process was and how long it was taking. I believe it had been in assessment over a decade. In updating for this hearing, we noticed that it had been removed from EPA's list of chemicals undergoing assessment, and we haven't been able to follow up on to exactly why that happened. It was on there a month ago and removed as of a day ago.
Dr. Teichman, do you know why RDX has gone missing?
I can tell you what response I got when I posed that same question to the staff. Nonetheless, I would prefer to give a fuller response as a question for the record, where the chemical managers involved would be able to comment on the decision process that is involved with that particular chemical. But it was indeed listed for possible assessment under the IRIS program. We've identified 48 assessments that we think are priority chemicals, and in the second batch, an additional 48 RDXs in the second batch. So I would prefer, again, for a question for the record to give the decision process as to why it's in the second batch.
Okay, thank you. If you would submit it out of the record. Mr. Whitaker, in a show of bipartisanship, would you raise the screen so we can all see the portrait of Mr. Bullard? I now yield back the remaining 10 seconds of my time and recognize Dr. Brown for another round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand there's a natural tension between thoroughness and timeliness assessments. The question is, will this streamlined process ultimately sacrifice scientific credibility, especially considering the recent negative reviews of the assessments by the National Academy of Science? And the question I have really for both of you is, if EPA can't get the assessment right in 10 years, what makes you think, each one of you, that you can produce better results in 23 months?
We think 23 months is optimistic. We're going to be looking, but the problem is, it's like a domino effect. If the assessment takes too long, there's new research that comes available. You have to reconsider, and it goes back to square one again. That's what I meant about the endless assessment and reassessment. This is supposed to be a process that synthesizes existing research that's available at the time and should be able to be done fairly quickly and vetted. These assessments are supposed to be updated routinely, you know, every 10 years. So with 540 chemicals in the list, if you're not doing at least 54 a year, you're not even keeping up. So we think this is very ambitious. We're not sure there's enough resources devoted to this yet, but that's a very good question.
It's a very ambitious goal.
It is an ambitious goal. I don't disagree, and we have certainly asked for additional resources to help us meet that goal in the President's budget request. There are a couple things, I think, though, that are different than perhaps the past as we look at the new process. The first is this new process, as I mentioned earlier, was developed in consultation with other federal agencies, and therefore I believe there is a mutual commitment to try and meet the schedule that has been identified. This does not mean that it isn't aggressive and that we shouldn't take a look and see in a year's time if we've been able to stick to it. We welcome that type of review and hope to be able to successfully demonstrate we were able to meet that goal of 23 months. A second is the listening sessions that I referred to earlier are still maintained in this process. This is a chance where at the external peer review meeting, but where there used to be an opportunity for somebody to speak for 2 or 3 minutes, or perhaps as many as 5 or 7 minutes, no longer than I was able to testify today, I would add, most likely, that was perhaps insufficient time for real discussion and exchange. The listening sessions actually now are for much longer periods of time, more interchange with those who have any opinions they wish about our draft assessments, and that listening session is indeed also shared with the external peer review panel and their assessment. So I believe that's a very positive step that will hopefully enable us to air for greater, longer periods of time potential disagreements in the scientific facts and let the external peer review panel tell us their disposition on those arguments.
Has the time frame for peer review changed at all?
I believe the time period is 60 days at this point. I think it might have been a little longer. I have to check. I apologize.
I've got it at 105 days.
There you go.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not real interested in a lot of conversations that go on around the water fountain. But those conversations that do have to do with scientific integrity as well as the scientific process, I think are very important, and I hope that we can, as a committee, can be reassured that those conversations will be reported and will be open and for public view. And it's just something I think is absolutely critical for scientific integrity, and that's what I'll just throw that out as a comment to both of y'all. And with that, I'll yield back to the chairman for the next round if we have one.
Thank you. Just one more brief round. I do want to point out that when we raised the screen to reveal the portrait of Mr. Bullard, we also revealed the portrait of a substantially slimmer Chairman Sensenbrenner, which is perhaps more bipartisan than I really intended to be. Dr. Teichman, step 4 of the new process is a independent expert peer review, which Dr. Brown has been asking about already. And our staff understands that that will usually be done on a face-to-face basis, meetings, and perhaps that could be transcribed. But in some cases, it will also be done by the National Academy of Sciences. We understand that peer review can be done by mail, it can be done through the internet, it can be done face-to-face, it can be done through an Academy of Sciences study. Can you give us a sense of what each of those different methods for peer review will cost and how you will decide which method?
First of all, let me, since I was under oath, correct the statement I said before about 60 days. Indeed, as my co-witness has said, now that I have it in front of me, it is 105. I was confusing with a different step. In terms of the cost for each of the individual types of peer reviews, I would like to provide that as information for the record. However, it is important to state that we very carefully consider the complexity of a given assessment as to which form of peer review that we would use. To use a letter review on an IRIS assessment would be very rare. At the other end of the spectrum, to go to the National Academy of Sciences, which we have done on the most controversial of chemicals, is hopefully equally rare, more times than not, we'll convene a peer review panel, which would have a face-to-face meeting that might be through a contractor choosing the panelists, or it might be our own science advisory board. And the cost for those 4 different options we'll be glad to provide, but certainly they vary as from the letter review to the NAS based on the complexity of the assessment.
Can you, Dr. Teichman, can you tell us who some of the contractors are who've been contracted with, that EPA has contracted with to conduct the peer review?
I'm only familiar with one, and any mention is not considered an endorsement, but nonetheless, I think the Eastern Research Group has been one of the organizations that our National Center for Environmental Assessment has used to locate peer reviewers and pull together such panels.
What procedures do you have in place to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest with firms conducting the peer review process?
The firms themselves, again, I would prefer to have a better chance to put this in the record than I'll be able to convey right now. But if you're talking about the choice of the firms, those are competed, and I don't know what confidentiality or impartiality statements they may have to be a successful bidder on the contract. However, the people who they hire as subcontractors as panelists, there are indeed statements that have to be provided where people state what their potential associations are and they demonstrate that they're impartial.
Mr. Stevenson, are you familiar with any work that the GAO has done on outside contractors for peer reviews?
Not specifically contractors, but there are 2 different brands of scientific advisory committees that EPA uses. There's 24 of them in total. And we noted in the testimony in the Senate that 7 of those have specific conflict of interest procedures for their membership, but the others do not. And that may not be inappropriate because you are trying to seek points of view on a given chemical or a given scientific assessment or a given regulation. So we just observe that EPA should not confuse the purpose of both of those 2 different kinds of scientific advisory committees.
Dr. Teichman, it seems that some of the most widely used chemicals with perhaps the most troubling health consequences are the ones that are tied up for the longest time or have been in the past in IRIS, formaldehyde, TCE, PERC, dioxin. How are you going to set priorities for completing assessments?
Well, indeed, we wish to tackle those chemicals that we think pose the greatest risk to the American public, and those become our priorities. It is not an issue of any particular stakeholder group interest one way or the other, anybody influencing our decision other than we believe it poses a high risk, and those become the chemicals that we go after. And we believe we do it in a rigorous fashion, that everybody has an opportunity to comment and to tell us if we've gotten it right in our draft, and hopefully we've done it correctly by the time we have the final assessment.
Okay. Are you going to include others, both interagency suggestions or outside?
We take suggestions from everybody as we publish our list of potential chemicals we could be working on and others that people wish to recommend. And that includes other federal agencies. It includes state and health organizations. It's a Federal Register notice asking for people's thoughts on what our agenda should be.
I yield back the remaining 3 seconds of my time. Dr. Brown, do you have any more questions?
Going back to the peer review process, Doctor, I'm looking at the document actually here, and you were correct the first time that you're supposed to announce a public comment period of 60 days for peer review, and again, as a physician, I'm concerned that 60 days, 105 days may or may not be enough, and 23 months may not be enough time to adequately evaluate each of these chemicals. How can you guarantee, but in the review process, how can you guarantee fairness in the IRIS review process if you give the public only 60 days to review?
We believe 60 days will be adequate to give the public fair opportunity to comment. We believe the combination of the listening sessions gives them even a chance to interact with us on the draft assessment prior to the external peer review panel coming together. If indeed somebody in a rare instance asks for an extension, and indeed the material in front of you discusses that potentiality, we do indeed offer such an extension, but we can't promise, in fact, that their comments will be before the peer review committee, and we believe it's best for as many public comments to be shared with the peer review committee as they make their deliberations.
Was a 60-day number just picked somewhat arbitrarily? Did y'all just think that that's a good period of time, or was there a particular thought in giving enough time but not too much?
I think that's a fair way of putting it. It was not arbitrary in terms of we plucked it at random. We plucked it out of midair. We think this is an appropriate amount of time. If it turns out, as we have explored this, that people feel they must have 90 days, for example, it is something to consider down the road.
All right, thank you, sir. Back to the transparency, will you commit to truly making the IRIS process transparent by creating a public docket for all materials received by EPA related to each IRIS assessment, including materials that EPA has received but which it decides it will not rely on to make its assessment decisions?
Yes, indeed. All comments that we receive in the written form, as we've discussed, will be in the public docket. We always include all the information that has been given to us, whether or not it is what we use in our final assessment, so that people see the total record and they can choose from among it as what they think should be influencing our final word.
So that's a promise to us that that will be done, and I hope you can promise us at some point that all those oral discussions and those conversations and consultations that do occur orally will be provided for the public also. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
May I just comment for a moment, Mr. Chairman, if I can? Again, we will be the oral comments I wish to come back to the agency and have further discussion on. On the written, I'm not aware that we have ever not put every written comment that we got from the public or as part of the peer review in the docket. What is interesting and new in this process is, in fact, now the written comments we get from interagencies will also be in the public docket.
I think we are now done with our questions. There's a phrase I've heard all my life, which I suspect is a Southern phrase. I'm sure Dr. Brown has heard as well then. When we want to disassociate ourselves from someone else, not take full responsibility for the conduct of another, we say, I didn't take him to raise. But it appears that I have taken IRIS to raise, the subcommittee has taken IRIS to raise, the GAO has taken IRIS to raise. So we will continue to watch IRIS closely. We think it's important that IRIS perform its mission and produce the right number of very sound, credible, scientifically sound, credible assessments.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
Dr. Brown.
Thank you for yielding, sir. I'm very happy you've taken IRIS to raise and that we're having this hearing and that you're continuing this process, because I think it's absolutely critical for the public to have total confidence in what assessments are made by IRIS and by the government across the board. I think there are many things that are being put out by the government that are declared scientific that aren't, and that does not things in the way of determinations that aren't accepted by the public, and I think rightfully so. And so I'm glad you have taken IRIS to raise, and I'm eager to continue in this process with you, sir. Thank you very much, and I congratulate you on taking IRIS to raise.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. We may not think alike, but we do talk alike. Before we bring the hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses today for testifying before the committee. We may see you again. Under the rules of the committee, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any answers to any follow-up questions the committee may have for the witnesses. Dr. Teichman, you had said you wanted to provide additional information. And with that, the witnesses are excused and the hearing is now adjourned.